Good evening. Welcome to tonight's MACRI Talk. I'm Sarah Gould, Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, we are joined by 3 podcasters who created podcasts that tackle Mexican American civil rights history and issues. We have with us tonight Jack Herrera, Eva Ruth Moravec, and Laura Pena. Welcome.
Good to be here.
I'm going to read you some short bios about our guests, and then we're going to launch into a conversation. Jack Herrera is a senior editor at Texas Monthly, covering immigration, Latino issues, and elections. He previously worked as a freelancer and as an independent contributor to many different magazines. He was a contributing editor with Politico magazine, an election correspondent with Prism, a contributing option writer with Business Insider, and a contributing reporter with Pacific Standard. His work has appeared in places like Politico magazine, The Guardian, The Nation, The New Republic, Columbia Journalism Review, Popular Science, PRI's The World, and Truth Out, as well as in syndication in places like Salon, The Week, and City Lab. In 2020, he was an Ida B. Wells Fellow with Type Investigations at the Type Media Center. Next up, we have Eva Ruth Moravec. She is an Austin-based independent reporter and podcast producer who also runs a nonprofit that provides data on the Texas criminal justice system. She has produced several narrative nonfiction podcast series, including chart toppers like Tiffany Dover is Dead and American Radical for NBC Universal, and Chicano Squad, an 11-episode series released by Vox Media that she also reported and wrote. An experienced print reporter, she has spent 17 years covering criminal justice, breaking news, government, and the occasional feature in Texas. She's freelanced for the Washington Post, ProPublica, the New York Times, Daily Beast, and numerous publications in Texas, and was on the staff with the Associated Press, San Antonio Express News, and others. Her nonprofit, the Texas Justice Initiative, serves as a resource for reporters, researchers, policymakers, and everyday Texans. And Laura Pena. Laura Pena is an attorney and activist with a wide range of legal policy and advocacy expertise in the field of immigrant justice and civil rights. She's a former Obama appointee and a federal government attorney. In 2018, she publicly disavowed ICE when the family separation crisis hit by writing an op-ed published by USA Today. After 18 years away, she returned to her border hometown to join efforts to reunify families separated by the US government. She currently serves as the director of ProBar, an immigration legal services organization in the Rio Grande Valley. Her work has been featured in several media outlets. She has testified before Congress, and she speaks nationally on topics of immigration, human rights, and border justice. In 2019, the Hispanic National Bar Association named her Latina Attorney of the Year. She lives in Brownsville, Texas, with her 2 rescue dogs, Maya and Dulce. Welcome, everyone. Okay, we have 3 podcasts that, if you're not a podcast listener, you really should check these out. And I'm going to put the links in the chat for everybody. But we've got White Hats, Chicano Squad, and Valle de Sueños, which are the podcasts I wanted us to learn about tonight, because they all connect to civil rights history and contemporary issues. And so first up, I would just love for all of you to take the opportunity to talk about, how did you decide to do this particular podcast? So let's maybe start with Jack and work our way around the circle. Okay?
Yeah, I think as a magazine writer, ambiguity is really the lifeblood of a long story and something that could become a podcast series. And so I grew up in California, but I grew up with deep family roots in San Antonio and Laredo, and I grew up, of course, with stories of the Texas Rangers and the movies. And so there was this really romantic image of basically these cowboy lawmen, on the images were on horseback or with their six shooters, Clint Eastwood, John Wayne image of these men bringing justice to a rough and tumble land. And I think when I got back to Texas, when I moved to start working for Texas Monthly, a lot of people who I really respect, a lot of writers and scholars, were really diving into another side of the Ranger history. And so it was Kat Cardenas, a former staff writer at Texas Monthly, now a very successful freelancer, who actually came up with the idea for White Hats. And I was lucky enough to actually become the host and be on board. And what she was looking at is this, it's not even the alternate history, but the history that didn't become dominant, that the Texas made a decision to deprioritize, which is in the 1910s and 20s, and especially, but in a history around that, the Rangers assaulting, extorting, and murdering Mexican Americans across the borderlands. And I think that the original idea, the sort of pinnacle of this violence, the climax, was the Porvenir massacre in West Texas in 1918, when basically almost all the men in the village of Porvenir were rounded up and killed by a Ranger force. And so when you put an event like that next to the actual monuments built all over, I live in Austin, the monuments to Rangers all around the Capitol, when you see that disconnect, it was just very obvious for us that there was a story there. And I'm glad that we had 6 episodes to tell it.
Eva Ruth?
Yeah, thanks for having me this evening. I can't take credit for the origin story for the Chicano Squad. I've been a reporter for a long time in Texas, and I've covered a lot of law enforcement and criminal justice, breaking news sort of stuff. And there was a podcast company in California who had come across a mention of the Chicano Squad in a story in the Texas Observer. And nobody really knew much more than that. And somebody reached out to me knowing that I was an independent reporter here in Austin and had some criminal justice reporting chops, and asked me if I could look into it and basically see if there was anything worth reporting a podcast on. And I grew up in Seguin, Texas, which is not far from Austin, small town. Living in a small town, you learn about a lot of different people and backgrounds. We had a pretty diverse upbringing, it felt like, as a Jewish family living in a small town. I just really became really interested in their story and all of the challenges that they overcame. So much like, the Texas Rangers, the Chicano Squad was born out of a time of great turmoil and racial injustice in Houston, and sort of came out of the tragic death of Jose Campos Torres, who was beaten in 1977 by Houston police officers. And he was a young man trying to figure out life after the Vietnam War as a veteran, returning back to Houston. He had actually never seen combat, but he had trained. And, at the time, the Houston Police Department was not very reflective at all of the overall population of Houston. As particularly, 16% of the population was Hispanic at the time, and only 6% of the police department was. And so there just became this obvious disconnect. There were several other fatalities that kind of came to light at the hands of the HPD after Jose Campos Torres's murder, and the Moody Park riot. It sort of became the battle cry for a lot of these people who had felt these injustices. And out of those tragedies and out of that turmoil was born the Chicano Squad, kind of as a challenge. These police officers who had grown up in Houston, were men of the city, they were kind of challenged, given this insurmountable seeming challenge to solve homicides among Spanish-speaking Houstonians. There was no other way to communicate with them. None of the homicide detectives at the time spoke Spanish, so they couldn't even speak to the victims, speak to the witnesses. So the Chicano squad was sort of came out of this. To me, it seemed like almost a challenge, like see what you can do. And they just had an amazing amount of success and clearance rates and gained trust in a community that really needed advocates and help and safety. And so, yeah, I was really happy to be a part of it. I did all of the reporting and interviewing and writing. I was not the host, so you don't hear my voice, which is great.
And Laura, we'll ask you more about that in a minute, Eva Ruth. And Laura, the origin of your story?
Yes. I'm hearing a little background noise. I don't know if it's from one of our participants.
I can mute myself.
Yes. I'm hearing a little background noise. I don't know if it's from one of our participants.
Is it better?
Yes. I think there was a little delay. We're good.
Okay. There we go.
Well, I want to thank the people who are joining. Want to acknowledge Jose Alcala coming in from Chicago on Facebook. Thank you for joining us, Chicago. El Chuy from TSU in Houston. Love it. Thank you for being here with us. My name is Laura. The question is about how did you come up with the podcast story? So I'm not a renowned journalist. I am an advocate here in the Rio Grande Valley, and I work with amazing people on a daily basis. Folks who are trying to make sense of the border that we live in today. I am from the Rio Grande Valley. I was born in McAllen, raised in Harlingen, and I currently live in Brownsville, Texas. I'm also an immigration attorney by background. And so in my practice, since 2018, I've been back on the border, really focused on the humanitarian situation at our border. First starting with the family separation crisis, then moving to a host of other policies under the Trump administration that were really horrendous. And then some of those policies that have continued under the next administration. And so the podcast that I came up with was to highlight a snapshot in time. What does it look like for one period of time in which advocates, border advocates, so folks on the border, both on the US side and the Mexican side, come together and try and resolve a pressing humanitarian issue? And so that is what my podcast is about. I was fortunate enough to find an amazingly talented co-creator, Charlie Vela, who is just so thoughtful and smart and super savvy with sound, and he's got a lot of gadgets that I just, he lends to me that I use in my little kitchen and try and record in the morning when my dogs are asleep. But that's the origin of this story. If folks follow immigration policy, it was the migrant protection protocols. There was a period of time where the Biden administration said, we're going to end this. And there was one particular refugee encampment in Matamoros, Mexico, that had sort of become symbolic of the Trump era. And what my podcast goes through is what happens when there's political will between the Mexican government and the US government to, with process and order and with human dignity, to close one of those encampments. Advocates did our best to try and make sure there was, humanity was recognized through that process and that nobody was left behind. So that's what the podcast is about. I may have answered your next question already.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. What I love about these three podcasts is it kind of moves us through time as we're thinking about, where are Mexican American civil rights as issues that they come up. And so Jack's podcast puts us sort of back in an earlier moment. and then Eva Ruth, I'm so sorry. Yours is more in the 60s, 70s, and then Laura, you bring us up to the present day, and the last kind of decade or so. What I think that these three podcasts help point out is that Mexican American civil rights is an ongoing issue. It's something that's been happening for a long time. And yet, even when we think about Jack's podcast, for example, that's set 100 years ago or so, a lot of the issues that you talk about in the podcast are still relevant. And so I'm curious, I think for Jack and Eva Ruth, you probably were talking to, I think I know this is, I already sort of know the answer to this, but you were talking to different researchers in putting this together. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of finding what you needed to put the text together for these podcasts, and how that may have resonated with the present day. And then Laura will alter that question a little bit for you about how within your professional practice, what you were examining maybe has connections to the arc of your career. So let's start with Jack, and how did this story come together? What kind of resource did you need to tap into to put this story together?
For one specific story that I think really, that sort of connection between the historical work and the current day, something that really drove it home to me, that Faulkner quote, the past isn't gone, it's not even the past. I was speaking with this woman, Arlinda Valencia, who is a descendant of one of the men, actually two of the men, killed in the Porvenir massacre. And I was sitting with her just outside El Paso in Horizon City. I had my microphone set up, talking with her, and I knew a lot about her story. And she was telling me about how she knew a lot of it, like the family history had been brought down because her great uncle had survived the attack. He was a 13-year-old boy and was spared by the Rangers. And so I assumed that his story had been something that had been passed down generation by generation. And I had this moment where she described, no, I actually sat in the same room as him and talked. He told me the story. Somebody who had been there in 1918, had seen them, heard the shots of the men killed, had heard, he had been the boy who had run to try and get help after the villagers went and found the men's bodies. And she sat in the room with him and talked with him about that story. And makes you think that 100 years ago is a long time, but it's also not that long, that there's over these people and then it's still affected. I think, I didn't know this about my own family, but when I mentioned to my grandmother that I was writing a story about the Texas Rangers, or working on a podcast series rather about the Texas Rangers, she said, oh yeah, the Rangers. When I was growing up, they told us you got to run from them. Like if you see a white hat, they don't like Mexicans. They attack Mexicans. You have to be careful. And that's, again, it's a sort of, I was driving the car with her, my head spins and I look at her because I've been reporting on how this is, how this affects Mexican American sense of safety and place in Texas. And I didn't even realize it was my own family's story. And I think that sort of reverberation, it just was so obviously coherent to me. I didn't at that moment, I realized I wasn't gonna have to prove to people like, hey, this is still relevant, this still matters, because it just, that wasn't an argument. It was just obvious. Like people still think about it. It still affects them. And I'm sure, I think Laura would definitely identify with this, but the rhetoric we hear today, we worry about the slippery slope. What happens when you're describing asylum seekers as an invasion? What happens when you're portraying chaos and danger on the other side of the Texas-Mexico border? The history that I was looking into, the time period, this was during the Mexican Revolution. There was a huge refugee crisis, hundreds of thousands of people trying to reach safety in the United States. It did get described as an invasion. And Texas mobilized a military force, which is a paramilitary force, which is the Texas Rangers on the border. And the consequences of that, at its worst, was the massacre of innocents. And I think that for me, it creates an eerie parallel when I see politicians across the leadership across Texas today invoking that language of evasion. And currently, next week they'll debate a bill about creating a border unit to that looks very similar to the special ranger units that were mobilized along the border in the 1910s during the Mexican Revolution, a mix of, I think paramilitary is the right way to describe it, a mix of enlisted agents and non-enlisted armed personnel patrolling the border, trying to fend off those dangerous guys on the other side. And I think that again, I don't have to work that hard. I don't have to stretch to explain how that history is relevant, because people are using the same words and employing the same strategies. And the only thing I can hope for is that the worst results won't repeat themselves.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Eva?
Yeah, so my story kind of started in 1977 and went all the way through kind of very recent history, when the Houston Police Department just a couple of years ago finally decided to include a display on the Chicano Squad in their police museum in downtown Houston. So it was still a history that was very much untold, and piecing it together was amazingly fun, but just gave me a whole new understanding of archives and what is kept, and, just where things are. So I mean, to answer the question about piecing things together, some of my story was, pre even really TV coverage. And so I spent a lot of time in archives in the Houston Library, in the University of Houston Special Collections, in Rice University's archives, and a lot of places, anywhere I could find in Houston that said they had anyone related to my story, which was lots of mayors over time, police chiefs, community members, and so on. I gathered a ton of records from the Houston Police Department, Harris County. One episode centered around the death of a police officer in Sugar Land, and Sugar Land Police Department gave me all kinds of stuff that was, there were all these tentacles to these cases that the Chicano Squad was working on. So lots of other agencies had their records as well. And then as well, I did a ton of interviews with the main characters were the members of the squad. We didn't get all of them participated, and were very, very generous with their time and their memories and their photo albums, as well as community leaders who, dug stuff out of drawers. I will say the one story that resonates as one that we're still trying to do better with today, I would say, is there was one case that I found in their case files about a missing girl named Liliana Reyes. And it was in 1987, and the Chicano Squad had been around for a few years, and they were really good. And they were great at solving homicides, but also at that time they were dealing with a lot of missing persons and kidnappings, because that's just what was, plaguing the population at that time. And it was not cartel related or anything like that. It was just kind of this random incident in which a woman who was kind of transitory, I guess, passing through Houston, ended up spending the night with this family and kidnapping this child. And she took her to Mexico. And it, just happened really fast. And then this woman shows up in Mexico, and she has a baby, or like a 3-year-old, and nobody knew where she had come from. And so there was all of this attention, only in the Chicano Squad for this case. It was like a very big deal for them. They went down to Mexico. They had to push for the resources to be able to fly down and actually treat this case the way that they should. And they were also like the FBI also looked to them to solve the case because they knew that they didn't have the resources and the communication and the trust of the community and everything like that. So Chicano Squad guys go down there. They end up finding her, and it's amazing. And they have the mom with her, and there's this nice reunion that people remembered in a hotel, and then immediately they all fly back to Houston, and they're getting off the plane. There's this ceremony at the airport welcoming her home and kind of congratulating the Chicano Squad. And then everybody leaves. And what had happened was baby Jessica fell in a well in Midland. It was this Anglo girl who was at her aunt's house, I believe, playing in the backyard and got stuck in this well. And Midland being, this big oil town, it was like such a big deal to try to get her free from this well. They knew she was down there. She was singing songs. It was it was before 24-hour news coverage, but it was basically around the clock coverage of this young girl. And meanwhile, back in Houston, Liliana went home. She continued to have a really nice relationship with the Chicano Squad guys. They would come visit with her every year and sort of celebrate her birthday with her. So anyway, and of course, baby Jessica got out and everything was fine with her as well. And I was able to find Liliana and interview her and her family. And, this was a story that it would have been a huge deal. I would think of a child, your child gets abducted and taken to a different country. It's just crazy, or different, across the border. It's really, it's foreign and it's scary. And, I'm sure they had no idea what to do. And it would have been scarring and traumatizing, I would think, for the family as well. And yet it wasn't something that they talked about. It wasn't something they had clippings of or really, thought about much at all. Sorry, this is getting long, but the connection to that made it really relevant to me was I spent a few years as a crime reporter in San Antonio, and I was always on going to breaking news scenes and, covering stuff covering often kidnappings, and just the stories that percolate to the top that get attention. Missing white girl still happens. And it was something that was very relevant, hearing these two stories at the time, back in 1987, and realizing I was a child then. I remember the milk carton kids and the missing kid, concern. And yet Liliana's story was one that was kind of a big a flash in Houston and then just completely disappeared. So I always try to remember that, that filter.
Wow. Yeah. And Laura?
Sure. I've just been listening. I've been enthralled by the prior speakers. I think, both with Jack and Eva's podcast, it represents decades of militarization of not only a border, but our cities. I do need to say these are my personal views, not of my organization. But it's important for me to reflect on that as I think about Valle de Sueños, which is set in 2021 around border immigration policies and the people who were being subjected to those policies and what they went through, right? Kidnappings, murders, multiple people died in this encampment, were targeted, sexual assault, abuse, children, parents sending their children alone to the United States because the conditions in Mexico while they waited were so dangerous. Mm-hmm. The Texas Rangers are basically the first border patrol. And now the state is even going to want to do it again, but on steroids or something. I don't know. But and Houston Police Department, locals police departments, there's always been local, whether it be municipal or county support to enforce immigration laws, whatever laws those were, or to use other laws to exclude people, to keep people out. And not to keep everybody out, but to keep brown people out, to keep Black people out, to keep religious minorities out, to keep people of different sexual orientation or gender identity out, right? So people who did not meet a particular standard that we deem worthy of U.S. citizenship. And that's baked into our immigration laws. It's baked into the border militarization complex. And so that's, both of these two podcasts really set the stage for the 10 days that I focus on. And it's not really, I didn't see it really as part of my career, but for folks, in particular, students, if you're listening, you see what's happening around you, and then you observe like what the news is saying. You observe what's happening on social media. And I think whenever you observe a disconnect between what you're experiencing as the reality versus what the input, right? There's lots of input. I think that's where conscientious citizens should make the decision to try and document those stories so they're preserved, so that the Evas and the Jacks, in 100 years that are looking at what happened during this time may be able to listen to the people I interviewed about their experience.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I would imagine that your experience as a lawyer has been the research for you, just your work. Whereas for Jack and Eva Ruth, I had to do a little bit of digging, which is what reporters do. So we appreciate
Yes.
that. I just want to.
Immigration law is clear as mud. I'm learning every day. It is a complex, somewhat backwards system, and I've been in it in very different angles. You said earlier I was a federal government attorney. I was actually an ICE prosecutor, so I've actually been on the law enforcement side. Which might surprise listeners, right? But I've seen that side. I've seen how people who are in law enforcement can become desensitized to the reality that they're dealing with. I've also seen from that side how unjust and unfair and cruel the system is. And it's intended to keep people out. Billions of dollars are spent to punish and deter people. And it's just, it's very imbalanced, to say the least.
I wanted to ask you about the format. Podcasting has really taken off over the last few years, and so I wanted, but having said that, print is not dead. Okay, but I wanted to ask you, what made you think about telling this story, each one of your individual stories, through the podcast format? What was appealing to you, and do you think it worked for you, for your story? And again, we'll start with Jack.
I think, the natural inclination was that when you talk about Tejano Mexican American history in Texas, so much of that has been recorded and transmitted through oral histories. So much of the dominant narratives that show up in textbooks or in the works of, Walter Prescott Webb, Fehrenbach et al., the big names in the history of Texas, those narratives get standardized and written down and shared in classrooms. And then the whole time there's this alternate history that's shared in stories people are telling each other. And it's just in the last few generations, just the last few decades, that historians who are raised with those stories, who I was lucky enough to interview for this podcast, have started getting that history down, committing it to the record. And I think that the podcast for me was it was a way to participate in that oral history, to participate in sitting down with people and saying, what happened? How did it affect you? What's the story here? I got to hear people tell me the stories that they heard from their great uncle or from their grandparent, or, at asadas, like sitting down and just talking with their dad about, over and over again, like, here's what happened. in 1940. Here's what happened in 1918. Like that was your great great grandmother. I was your bisabuela. You know, like that. Like basically telling those stories. How good is it that I can sit and listen to those, and I can set up my field mic and just talk with them and get that in the podcast form? It felt very natural. It felt like the right way to do things.
Mm. And how about for you, Eva Ruth?
Well, it was an assignment to, I mean, first the question was, is this worth digging into? Is there enough here to, you know, make anything like a podcast? And then there was definitely enough. And I guess I was just lucky. I felt very lucky to be able to tell the story with audio because talking to the guys and hearing their stories is what really brought them to life. Like they're just such amazing storytellers on their own. And they were so passionate about what they did. And you know, there was so much passion, I guess, all around it, from people in the community who were desperate to have an advocate and to have safety and to have representation and to not feel like they were constantly under patrol. There was just, it was just passion all around, not to mention, like at the time I was doing it, the Houston police chief was Art Acevedo, who's a very passionate person. So it was just like, he was excited about it. And, you know, everybody's emotions, I think, came through in the storytelling and in those audio interviews. It was honestly the first big audio thing I had ever done. I have a long history, or not that long, but like 15-ish years of print reporting. And to me, it was just the most incredible thing. Like people would actually forget about the mic setup, you know, and you could really just get into moments and like lose yourself in this history in a way that I didn't feel like I had ever been able to accomplish in print. And then I think like also the just the sound of things. I mean, like the voice of our narrator, the music that we used, it was all very democratic. There were, you know, people had ideas on the team. But I was really excited to be able to use Brownout, an Austin-based band that has Latino roots. They pull from all different sounds, but they wrote our theme song, which was really fun. Like people wanted to get involved in the audio piecing things together. And then the use of archival footage, I think, really just like brings people into those moments when it's around. There was also a lot of lack of archival footage, which was telling to me too about, you know, that these weren't the stories that were being celebrated in the same ways as, you know, some of the big crimes that maybe white detectives were solving. So yeah, I just was really lucky that it was an audio format, and I think podcasts, when I think about it, it makes me smile just because I can hear their voices, and I feel like people actually got to know them through their voices. But that's the idealist in me. So,
well, I feel like now we have to ask a little follow-up question to that. So on the one hand, your podcast was produced by one of the big names in podcasts, Vox Media, and also they tapped as the host or the narrator a well-known celebrity. Can you talk about that a little bit before we jump to the next speaker?
Sure. I'm pretty sure I can disclose all of this. So I was working for a company called Fugitive Media, and we actually wrote and created the whole podcast before, and then basically sold it to Vox after we were finished. So we had already, Cristela was already on board. Cristela Alonso was our amazing narrator. And at the time, there was this thinking, I think, in podcasts that you needed a host who had like some sort of following or reputation or swagger, something to bring to the party. And in addition to, her lived experiences in Texas, and also just like her own passion and her own interests in just society and civil rights. And so she was very excited to do it. We had a few other narrators that we definitely wanted somebody who was a Latino in Texas, somebody who had that experience from Texas. And yeah, so Vox, they had, I want to say like all 11 episodes were pretty much written, done, created, completely even narrated for the most part before they even bought it, or before they came on board. And then we did make some changes. We had, new editors that came on with that. But we were lucky that they were interested in the story. I'm not sure how that should have worked, like what the right way about that would have been and I guess everybody's project is a little bit different, but if we had been, partners with Vox from the very beginning, I don't know what that would have looked like, but we had a really small team putting it together, and it was very much like our vision for it to be the way in a lot of ways, the way that it came out. So yeah, it was kind of before Vox had their own big podcast network. We started Chicano Squad in 2019, and it came out in January of 2021.
Wow. Okay.
So that was Stella. Yeah.
Fantastic. So now I will just say, I think that a lot of podcasts are just independently produced. It's amazing how, in a way, podcasts are relatively easy to create if you want to. Although I mean, okay. Well, let's hear from Laura. How is it to create this independent podcast?
It is, I would say it's not easy to do it well. And I'm really glad you asked that follow-up question, Sarah. I'm going to kind of respond, because there is like with any industry, if you're not in the industry, it's hard to know the rules, the terms of engagement, and how the industry is developing. And so when I had the idea for Valle de Sueños, I was like, I know this is a great idea. I have an amazing co-creator. We drafted all the episodes, we had all the content, and then I went to companies like Eva's, and they were like, oh, you're already doing this, so you should keep doing it, because what we do is we actually do this work, and then we pitch it to these companies to purchase. So that was what I realized. I was like, oh, okay, so that's probably not the path for Valle de Sueños. It was a different path. Which was fine. And then there's this thing called sponsorships. I haven't done that. I haven't had time to find sponsors, the little commercials and things in between. So I think that's another idea that certain podcasts can do and can pursue to try and get some funding. What I ended up doing was applying for some grants. So I got 2 very small grants from a local media organization called Trucha RGV. So the podcast is created in partnership with them. And when I say small grants, I think over the last 2 years, we've gotten maybe $5,000, and they're funded by Hispanic in the Arts Foundation, something like that. And so if you're thinking about doing a podcast and you have an idea, finding local organizations in the arts or in media /arts/media, right? Can be a way for you to get a little bit of seed funding to make your podcast become a reality. So my format it was also hard to determine, and it sort of evolved, but I'm both the storyteller and I'm living the experience, but also trying to document and give voice to other people who are also living their experience. Again, it was like 10 days of a humanitarian operation to shut down a refugee encampment in Matamoros, Mexico. And so what's also a challenge of doing something that's relatively present day is people don't have the benefit of recovering from really extreme situations. And so I'm like, my friends, I know you don't want to talk about what we went through. You're probably doing that in therapy. You should continue doing that in therapy, but let's hash it out again. And here's a mic. So for me, it was a bit of a stretch for like trust, right? So I had to have trust and just acknowledge that it may have, or I know that it reopened wounds, secondary trauma type of situations, because it was really dire circumstances that we were all working under. And so those are some of the challenges, I think, different, like people reflecting, having time to heal, even if it's a traumatic situation, versus it be still being very, very present day. I think I answered the question.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, has there been any feedback that you've received, public response? I don't know exactly. Once you stick something up into these different sites, do they give you a sense of how many people have listened? Or I know in a way on some of the sites you can rate them, but how do you feel the public response has been?
For mine?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we got 1,000 downloads like 2 months ago.
Fantastic.
So we're on Podbean. So there are services that'll, distribute it to multiple platforms.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Fantastic.
so that was a milestone, and I don't have time to track it very closely, but I'm happy with that. And when I'm around, people say, "Hey, I'm listening. Great, great stuff." So it's honoring the work that we do here, and I hope at some point that it does get wider, broader national recognition.
I think that's very good news. I mean, just in terms of educating the public, right, about what's going on. It's great to hear that people are listening. Yeah. And Jack, have you gotten any feedback on people tuning in?
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of feedback, a lot of emails and messages, and I think, the Rangers, it's a provocative podcast. The Rangers have such an auspicious place in the Texas imagination that I think a lot of people were very upset to hear the criticism, and also had, fair responses, which is that the Rangers have a 200-year history. And of course, they did a lot of good things in that time. Like they, protected innocent people, save kidnapping victims, et cetera, et cetera. Why'd we choose not to focus on that? And that was a fair question. And I think that I'm used to getting negative feedback, the hate mail that's just, going to call me names and tell me what I should go do. But it was nice to get a lot of feedback that was negative, but engaged with it, had to listen to all the episodes, or at least some of them, and was saying, "Hey, I think you got this wrong." And I could engage in that back and forth. And we had started releasing episodes before we finished recording. It's a narrative podcast, but we did have room, and some of the harsher critics that I had the chance to call them back and put a mic down between us and let's get into this. Like, you disagree with me, let's talk about it. That was satisfying. I think that for me, the most meaningful I tend not to read the comments on my own work. I don't even know, try and pay too much attention about how much downloads it all has. I like promoting it, obviously, like I'm on here right now, but I tend to just focus on doing the story as best as I can, and then leave it to, I'm so fortunate to work with a really talented engagement team at Texas Monthly who will help get my work into people's earbuds in front of their faces when it's written. But what was really meaningful for me was after the first episodes come out, just over and over again, every time I was on the radio or on TV talking about it, or just when people listened and they'd send me an email or DM me on Twitter saying that, "Hey, the stories you're telling, my family has one of those too. Like, we lost the Rangers were part of what helped, the King Ranch dispossess us of our land. And, the ranch that we had is now, we don't have that in our family anymore. My great-great-grandfather was killed by the Rangers. So many different, Mexican-American Tejano families across Texas are growing up with these stories. And the fact that, I don't know, I think that people felt some grounding in that this is a real history that people do care about. I think that was meaningful for folks, and without being too trite about it, I think that gives people some ground to stand on. And that to me was a positive impact. Honestly, if I just reached like 3 or 4 people who would send me those emails, that was enough for me to feel like it was worth it to do the show. And again, it's hard to say without feeling corny, but this is my family's history. And it's something that I would have thought about myself a lot differently if I'd grown up and known these details. And so the fact that it was so meaningful for me to learn this stuff, to bring it to other people, it's justified.
Right. And just as a quick follow-up, were you trying to get this podcast out before the big anniversary of the Rangers? Was that the plan?
So it was a happy coincidence that we were deciding to do this podcast, and as we thought this was a story really worth diving into. Rangers had such a huge history. We were trying to figure out, we're just telling the story at the Porvenir massacre? Are we just talking about La Hora de Sangre? We're just talking about like their early years, when they were mostly focused on fighting native peoples of Texas. And as we were sitting down to this planning, I think my one of the producers on the team, my co-writer and producer, Patrick Michaels, was like, "Hey, I realized next year's the 200th year anniversary," and we sort of just high five, like, good timing. We picked a good news peg, and so it was it just ended up being a great opportunity to get it out, especially because the Rangers right now are celebrating their bicentennial, and we get a chance to talk with the state employees and nonprofits that are working on doing that commemoration. And I think it started a good dialogue about what it looks like to commemorate, to remember history that isn't uniquely positive.
Right. And Eva Ruth, how's the feedback been?
It's been interesting. I mean, the huge benefit of having Vox distribute it was that it got widely distributed. We did get quite a bit of coverage, which was really amazing. I was tickled by it all. I've really enjoyed I have no idea how many downloads we've had. That's part of the black box that I'm not privy to, but I do read the comments from time to time, just on like Apple Podcasts or wherever. And I am always just, really encouraged when people tell me that it's a piece of history that they never knew. A lot of people will tell me they lived in Houston their whole lives, or they had family who lived in Houston and they never knew this. And they're just like, how could this be? And we definitely had that sort of the timing of also the Houston Police Department. Once we started looking into it, they also were like, oh, we need to do something. We need to put something in our museum for the Chicano Squad. So it kind of like piggybacked on itself. Then we're covering, I was like in Houston City Hall covering the proclamation that it sort of felt like was happening because there was this new attention to the squad. But and there was some negative feedback, which I'm definitely used to as a criminal justice reporter for a long time. The timing of the release was tricky, and we couldn't get into like how it's relevant today because Vox just honestly didn't know how to navigate all of that. And so I will say that it was intentional that Cristela had a voice. Her lines, she wrote most of her lines, many of her lines. And she was able to say things that she wanted to say. And some people, frankly, weren't very happy about that, thought that it was a little bit slanted, but it's like, well, this is history, whether you like it or not. My favorite piece of feedback probably came from, I hope this isn't a spoiler for anyone, but one of the Chicano Squad guys went wayward and got into a bit of trouble. And while he did not want to be on the podcast, we had many conversations. And after the podcast came out, he called me and told me that he had listened to the whole thing and asked me if I would ghostwrite his book. And there was it was pretty, it was accurate. I went through hundreds of pages of court transcripts. It was real, but it wasn't pretty for him. And that was very meaningful to me. And also just hearing from the other guys that, like, yeah, it was all out there. It wasn't all beautiful. It wasn't all, put them in the best light, but it was real. And they, vouched for that, which I was like, okay, good. Thank you. That was meaningful.
Well, I'm hoping that, of course, everybody watching this is going to want to either get caught up on the three of your podcasts or recommend them to their friends if they've already listened to them. But before we close things out, I wanted to ask each of you if you could recommend an additional podcast that we should be listening to. Anybody?
I'm going to give a plug for The Art of Power by Aarti Shahani. She interviews people in power and dissects the art of it. And so it's great learnings more on like the leadership angle. So that's an excellent one.
I think I'll be a company man and recommend Boomtown, which is our podcast on the Permian Basin and West Texas oil culture. Christian Wallace is an incredible writer and, West Texas kid. And I think a few of the episodes I think actually all the episodes, very quickly you realize that, we're talking about the history of the Permian and the people who are working the patch. So many Chicano accents and last names to get roll R's for that he interviews. And I think that it just because, it's so great. I was thinking about this, Ava, when you're talking about, print versus podcasting, or Laura, when it talks about amplifying voices, or it just how great podcasting is that you don't have to figure out how to convey a person's words to an audience. You don't have to figure out how this person explained themselves to me like this. How do I then convey that to my audience? I can just hold a microphone and transfer it to people's ears. That's a really great thing. And I think Christian's podcast does a great job with that he's such a beautiful writer, but he has the restraint to just give people a long time to talk about how they see themselves.
Sounds good. Okay.
I'm going to do two. One, because I have to shamelessly plug, and one because I just really love it. The one that I really love right now is called Love Janessa. It's about catfishing and internet personalities. It's hosted by a woman from Nigeria who has the most amazing, velvety, beautiful voice. And it's just really entertaining to listen to. Along those lines, if you're into kind of conspiracy theories and questions like that, we just released a bonus episode, our final bonus episode for a podcast called Truthers. Tiffany Dover is Dead. It's about a woman who was a nurse, an emergency room nurse in Chattanooga, and got the vaccine for COVID on live TV and fainted. And it was during the rollout when, they were trying to give everybody shots on live TV to prove that it was safe. And so the internet decided that, she had died, and they kind of took her story and ran with it. And so it's also just kind of a fun trip through conspiracy theories and history and COVID and trying to decipher what truth is.
Wow. Okay, we're going to be busy listening to podcasts. Well, thank you so much. We're almost at the end of our hour. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to ask what Laura's was. I'd love to hear your...
Oh, it was the Art of Power. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
No worries. No worries.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you again for sharing this information with us. One of the things that we really are trying to do here at MACRI is to provide information that we maybe never learned in school, right? And I think that your podcasts are doing that too. These are exploring topics that we never really got to learn about in school. So thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing and for sharing this with us tonight. Of course, I want to thank everybody who tuned in either tonight live or who will be watching this later on. Thank you for checking it out. I want to thank our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, AARP, Wells Fargo, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Texas Historical Foundation, and individual donors like you. If you liked tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI at somosmacri.org. We regularly have programs like this, and you can find our calendar of events on our website. Please have a great night, be safe, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.